This is the first of 3 videos that cover the Consumer Experience, or CX, standards, guidelines and checklist. This video discusses the CX standards. For helpful context, see the video Consent Flow, Consumer Data Standards and Guidelines, Part 1. In Chapter 1, the Consent Flow video provides a brief introduction to the consent process. In Chapter 2, Consent Flow Consumer Experience, the Consent Flow video describes the consent model and shows how the CX guidelines suggest ways to present the consent process to the consumer. Many of the CX standards relate to details of the consent model phases of consent, authenticate, authorize, and consent management. The CX standards are documented in the Consumer Data Standards under the heading Consumer Experience. The terms used in the CX standards to specify requirement levels such as must, must not, should, and may are as defined in RFC2119 Keywords for use in RFCs to indicate requirement levels. The CX standards specify a data language to describe data so that consumers always see data described in a familiar and consistent way. Data is grouped into clusters to support informed consent and data minimization. Authorization scopes serve to limit the scope of consents granted by consumers to share data. The data cluster language maps to authorization scopes. For each data cluster, there are related permissions and a related authorization scope. There are common data language standards and data language standards specific to each sector. The CX accessibility standards are specified to aid comprehension and accessibility. They relate to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. The CX consent standards specify binding requirements on how the consent process is presented to the consumer. The consumer must give informed consent, and the standards specify the information and choices the consumer must be given. The CX Authentication Standards specify binding requirements for the authentication step of the consent model. The CX Authorization Standards specify binding requirements for the authorization step of the consent model. The rules do not allow data holders to introduce elements in the authorization flow other than those specified in the rules and standards. However, the CX Authorization Standards provide some flexibility using requirement levels such as may and should to allow for consumer interactions that require special treatment. The Amending Authorization Standards specify binding requirements on notifications and other actions associated with a consumer amending a consent. The CX Notification Standards specify how a joint account holder must be informed of a number of events that occur in relation to joint account data sharing. The CX Withdrawal Standards specify information that should be communicated to a user in the course of the withdrawal process. This includes requirements for withdrawal of consent, authorization, secondary user instructions, and joint account approvals. The CX standards specify binding requirements. The CX guidelines provide suggestions on how the rules and standards related to the consumer experience can be implemented. See the second video in this series, CX Guidelines. Thank you for participating in the Consumer Data Standards, CX Standards, and Guidelines.